Now we're going to take a look at the Heightfield Terrain specific nodes. There's some really cool stuff for post-processing erosion and terraces and using slope and some cool stuff we can do. That's now all new as part of Vue 2016. So I'm just creating a Heightfield Terrain, and let's make a more interesting looking terrain, something to work with here. We'll try Voronoi. And I'm going to turn off zero edges because that's actually not part of the calculation. Zero edges is applied after everything else. If you want to create a custom zero edge, what you can actually do is go into Noise and Math Patterns, Tooth Gaussian, and let's see, let's go ahead and connect that to the position. We'll take a look at the size here. Maybe 0.65, and you can adjust this is going to be the multiplied value, and then we can take a blender. 0 is the fractal, 1 is the Gaussian, altitude output, set our ratio to 1, and then we're going to multiply. And we do need to make a few modifications here. Let's take a look at the output, and right now it is -1 to 1. We actually want 0 to 1. So what we're going to do is add a filter in between there and change that over to, well, let's map it. We could just offset it, but I want to use the mapping feature because then I can raise the output value if needed. So then we can go back to that tooth Gaussian and we can change that size. So if we do it this way, rather than within the terrain editor using zero edges, that'll allow us to basically apply any sort of post-process height field nodes and have this part in the zero edge included in that. Okay, so I'm going to just tweak that a little bit. Change our scale. And maybe a little smaller. That should be alright. Okay, so if we right click and go to Heightfield, we've got a bunch of options that aren't available through procedural terrain because these are all post-process effects. Essentially, the terrain is basically baked at whatever resolution you have set, and then from there it starts applying all of the erosion effects. Or not just erosion, just all of the different height field effects. So we have auto mapping, which is going to try to place it between -1 and 1 if possible. First we're going to take a look at terraces. Go ahead and select the output there, connect that. And now we can see we've got all these terraces around, and what we can do is adjust the size of the terraces, the height of each one. You can see it's stretching out the layers. We can smooth out the contours and smooth out those edges if we don't want it so sharp. We can adjust the slope width, which will also kind of smooth it out. So this is kind of a fast way to create quick terraces on that. And these features are replacing the effects features that we have. So under effects we have erosion effects, which are also post-process effects. The only thing is, once you apply them, you can't modify them, you can't change them. So now we have different nodes we can use in the function editor in order to complete these tasks and do those different effects. Now we have a couple of outputs. We have altitude and slope as an output for the terraces. If we take a look at slope, we can see all the different sloped edges, and that means what we can do is use that either to control erosion, or we can use it to control the material distribution if we want to place a material just on certain sloped areas, although the material editor itself does have the ability to just confine to specific slope. So it really depends on if you're going to be doing anything else to the terrain. And sometimes slope calculations can take a little render time, but mostly with procedural terrains, not so much with Heightfield. So let's go ahead and add in one of the erosion nodes. We can either use the individual erosion nodes, which have different presets, basically confined to just a few features, a few customizations, vertical scale and time scale. These are present in all of the different nodes. Vertical scale, what you have to do is set the size of the terrain and the scale. So what we can do is look at the terrain, and we can see that it's 383 meters on the Z. So we need to make sure that the vertical scale goes up to at least that. And then the time scale is essentially how many passes it takes. So right now it's at a time scale of 200. So it's going to take whatever preset you have and basically apply it 200 times. So the higher you increase this, the more times it's going to apply the effect. So if we use just gorges right now, then Vue's going to start to process that erosion, which in some cases can take a little bit. I've had 8K terrains that take about 20 minutes with one erosion filter on them, which actually isn't that bad for an 8K terrain. So now we've got a little bit of erosion, and I have just a very small resolution right now in the terrain, but we're getting these nice little bits of erosion around the edges, but we don't have the ability to really customize this. So what we can do instead is use the Heightfield Erosion Custom, which has all of the same presets in it. And then what we can do is go through and modify all the individual settings. So let's go ahead and replace the gorges with this Erosion Custom, and delete the other one. And let's choose furrows. And we'll let that process. And now we can see that nice bit of erosion coming down. One thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add in Heightfield. Let's do auto mapping, and that should give us a better output. -1 to 1. You can see that there. And I'm just going to change that back down. And I might need to just increase the height of the terrain itself, but this will keep it within standard bounds of the terrain. So let's just let that finish processing, and then I'm going to click OK, and then take a look at the vertical scaling in the layout. Okay. So now it's really short, so let's go ahead and scale that up. And then take a look at the height, 300 meters, so we'll keep that in mind. Go to the Erosion Custom Vertical Scale, we'll do 300 meters, we want to process that far. We can adjust the strength of the erosion, which shouldn't increase the time it takes to apply the erosion. And that looks like a really high amount there. So let's bring that down. Now, one thing I want to note is that for all of the presets, we have the same set of parameters we can control with the sliders. But as we switch them around, it'll change all of these sliders to match the new preset. But what I want to note is that if you were to say select furrows, and now it changes these settings. Now if you were to say copy all of these down and then change this over to rivers and then change all of these sliders to match what you just had for the previous preset, it would be different because all of these sliders are specific to whichever erosion control you're using. So each one does have its own internal set of settings, and you won't be able to duplicate them without changing the preset. So this one's showing up. It's pretty neat looking. What we could also do is use that slope output to control parts of the erosion or where we want it to be eroded. So I've just gone ahead and set the erosion strength to 0. So this is going to have no erosion on it whatsoever. And then when we had it at 1 before, we saw some nice erosion. So what I want to do is take the erosion strength, connect the parameter, and connect that to slope. So now it's going to confine the erosion to just the sloped areas. And we could invert that if needed. But I just want to take a look at what it looks like right now. It's kind of interesting looking. So let's go ahead and reverse that. I do want to make sure and take a look at our output here. And it looks like we've got 0 to 5. Well, I don't want it to go that high. So I'm going to go in here and map it. So we have an input range of 0 to 5, which we want to actually be 0 to 1. And I do want to invert it and see how that looks. So let's do 1 to 0. And we'll let that process. And that's kind of cool looking. So it's nice to be able to use additional outputs to control the different erosion effects. Let's go ahead and change this over to flow channels and see how that looks. And I might just remove the terraces for now and just see the straight terrain by itself and erode that. Not really seeing too much right there. But I bet if I look at it before the erosion, it's going to look a lot different. And it does. Let's go back to altitude. And let's do furrows really quick. I do like the furrows the way it looks. Okay, so we got a nice little bit of erosion on there. Now, one of the coolest things about these erosion nodes is the outputs. We got flow surface, flow speed, flow vector, flow depth, transported sediment, and displaced soil. I think the most important ones are the flow depth and the speed to give a really cool look for material distribution. So with the setup, let's go ahead and add in an output custom dependency, and we'll name it flow depth. And then we'll add in Heightfield auto mapping, and then connect that to the flow depth, and then we can use that to control material. So I'm just going to let that process really quick, and it's also processing the material distribution. Okay, so now let's take a look at a material. And I'm going to do some stone here. shiny, bring that down 0.5. And I'm also going to increase the scale of the rock. And that looks a little better. And now let's add in a layer to add on top of that. And I want something that's going to stand out. Grass will actually stand out pretty well, but I might want something a little darker. Let's see how the dirt looks. Should be nice and dark. And I'm going to take those highlights and really bring those down. It's supposed to be shiny stones within it. So let's go ahead now and edit the alpha production for this. Now, one thing is it does get a little hard to start lining these up when you got big functions, which makes it kind of a pain. But I'm going to go ahead and grab the alpha up here, and then I'll add in input, external dependency, and select that flow depth. And then we can connect the alpha to that. And let's see how that's showing up. So we might need to swap those or invert. And it might be processing the material now instead of before. So let's go ahead and I'm just going to render. And it looks like we've got opposite what I was looking for. A lot of times it throws you off when you have the inverted alpha. So I'm going to go ahead and select this and invert it and see if we can get it to look different. And it looks like I'm just going to have to go into the material and do it. Or go into the graph and do it. So let's take a look at the flow depth as altitude. And be able to look at the node preview. We do have to wait for it to process. So here we go. And yeah, inverting that isn't going to do much because this is giving us a rough preview really quick. So what I want to do is I'm going to have to cut it and invert it. And we can do that with a map filter or a smooth map. Let's do a smooth map. And that way we don't have anything going over. And the output, if we take a look here, it's not really showing us what that's going to look like. So I'm going to bring that down a little, as long as it doesn't go below 0, which it might. And just kind of crop it until I get what I'm looking for, which is kind of the lower areas. So now we're starting to get better spikes out of it. Let's do negative 0.75. And that's looking a little bit better. So since black is what shows through, let's go ahead and swap the output range. And I will bring this down to, let's say, negative 0.85. And that looks a little more usable. So now we can go back and change the output to the smooth map for the external dependency, change the altitude back to the altitude from the erosion, and let this process really quick. And we can already start to see what's showing up here. And I still have it inverted in the filter. So if I wanted those lines to be dark, I could just reverse that. I kind of like the way that looks. I'm just going to go ahead and do a quick render of that. Just increase the sun a little bit. Let me adjust that. There, and we'll do a quick final render just to see how that looks. And that's kind of neat looking. And of course, we could always go back and adjust that smooth map if we need to change where we want the lines and how sharp they should be. But I'm going to go ahead and reset this filter and reverse it so we have that dark dirt layer showing up in the lines or through those cracks. And in this case, what we have is the rock material is really becoming the prominent detail for the terrain. And when you're working with Heightfield terrains, because in a lot of cases you have a smaller resolution, you do need to rely on the materials to really give you a good look for it. Because in this case, we got a 512 by 512 terrain, which is not a lot of polygons. If we take a look in the scene, we have 522,000 polygons, so that's pretty low for a terrain. So using different bump channels will give you a lot more detail. And for this rock, it's because it's a lot larger. We turn that down a little bit. We should see more of the detail of the terrain and less of the material bump. And now we can see that a little bit smaller. I do actually like it reversed though, because it looks neat with the kind of lighter lines that flow through there. And we'll go more in depth with this a little later. There's a lot we can do with the erosion nodes, but I just want to do kind of a quick overview right now. So I am going to go back and we can take a look at some of the other Heightfield nodes that are available. Let's go ahead and just get rid of the erosion node. And we'll just get rid of the material control as well. Okay, so what else we could do is add in Heightfield. There's blur, so we can actually just blur it out if we need to, which is kind of cool. So within the graph, we can set a blur radius, and that's a post-process effect that will be applied. Pretty straightforward. And there's convexity. Convexity is essentially the edges of features. So let's say you had a rock and you had like some sharp edges around it. That would be where you would use the convexity to apply, say, a material or anything to just that specific part. And you can get some pretty neat effects by using that as a mix. And then, of course, slope. Now, in most cases, you wouldn't use slope to control the material from here, just because you have those options in the material editor in the layer. So you really wouldn't need to define it this way. But it is available. But it's mostly here to mix with other nodes. So that's kind of the basics of the Heightfield nodes. And I do have some cooler erosion stuff I'm going to show you a little bit later in other lessons of the training.